Please, let my daughter and me stay the night. She can sleep inside. I'll take the shed." The hoarse plea was nearly swallowed by the north wind. It was only late September of 1887, but freezing rain was already lashing across the Kansas plains, bringing winter unseasonably early. Lydia Braddock, who had kept the farm running alone for nearly 11 years, stood motionless beneath the porch roof. She did not answer. Outside the gate, the man stood ankle-deep in the mud. One hand gripped the mare's reins, the other steadied the broken wagon. He did not take a single step into the yard. Lydia's eyes swept over his soaked boots, then stopped on the little girl wrapped in a wet blanket on the saddle. Those tiny hands clutched a worn tin spoon, gripping it as if it were the only thing left in the world she could not lose. Wind hammered the wooden walls. Darkness and the biting cold closed in around them. Lydia stepped off the porch, but stopped several feet from the gate. She asked his name, where he had come from, and why he had crossed onto her road. The man replied that his name was Kieran Holt, a traveling windmill and pump repairman. He was heading to Fort Harlan for promised work. The wagon axle had snapped in the mud, and Rowan had strained a front leg. "There isn't anyone else?" Lydia asked. "No, just my daughter, Nell. My wife, May, died 4 years ago." Nell never begged. She looked once toward the warm kitchen window, then down at the tin spoon in her hand. Lydia unlatched the gate. 3 rules. Don't touch my livestock. Don't open my tool shed without asking. At first light, if the road allows it, you leave. I understand. She led Rowan beneath the south lean-to of the barn. When Kieran offered to sleep in the tool shed, Lydia shook her head. "It's too cold tonight." Nell was given the small room beside the kitchen. Kieran took the narrow sofa in the front room. Before closing the door, Lydia slipped the ring of keys from its hook and into her apron pocket. Lydia added another log to the stove. "The wet clothes will chill the house," she said, nothing more. She handed Kieran an old work shirt and trousers that had once belonged to her father. He started to refuse. "I don't intend to nurse a sick man tomorrow." Nell perched on the edge of a chair, careful not to let her muddy boots touch anything. Lydia laid a towel in front of her. "May I use it?" Nell asked. The question lingered. Lydia knelt, wiped the mud from the little girl's boots, and exchanged the damp towel for a dry one. Nell tried drying her own hair, but her trembling hands dropped the cloth. Without a word, Lydia held one end while Nell finished. Kieran returned wearing the dry clothes. He quietly folded his wet things beside the stove and asked where they could drip without staining the floor. Lydia warmed beans, cornbread, and a little salt pork. When Nell carefully took out her mother's tin spoon, Lydia reached for another bowl and set it in front of the child without asking a single question. During supper, Lydia asked when they had last eaten. Kieran said they still had hard bread that morning. Nell lowered her eyes. Lydia never challenged the answer. She simply spooned more beans and salt pork into the little girl's bowl. Kieran explained the promise waiting in Fort Harlan. A mill owner had offered winter work, repairing pumps and maintaining windmills. If everything held true, he and Nell would have a room behind the mill. "You know your trade," Lydia said. "Why travel with a wagon ready to fall apart? I spent what money I had on Rowan's leg and medicine after Nell's fever. I repaired the axle twice. The mud finished the job." Nell looked around the quiet kitchen. "Do you really live here alone? For nearly 11 years. Is it hard hearing every sound when you're the only one?" Lydia watched the stove flame lean toward a draft slipping through the north door. "Only when the house has something to say." Outside, the loose barn board struck the frame. Once, twice, then a third time. That night, Lydia lay awake. She heard Kieran checking the outside latch. Rain dripped steadily from the porch roof. Nell turned beneath her blanket in the small room beside the kitchen. Near midnight, A sleepy voice whispered, "Mama." Kieran was beside the bed before the word had faded. He never lit the lamp. He rested one hand on the blanket. "I'm here. Is the wagon still out there? It might be ruined." A pause. "But we're still together. Do we leave tomorrow? If the road is safe." Lydia heard every word through the thin wooden wall. She reminded herself it was none of her concern. After a while, Nell's breathing settled into an easy rhythm. Kieran remained beside the bed for another minute before returning to the narrow sofa. Lydia stared into the darkness above her. For almost 11 years, the house had been silent. Tonight she understood something she had never admitted. Silence was not the same thing as peace. It was simply something she had learned to live with. Morning arrived without rain, but the land had changed. The road beyond the Braddock gate had become a ribbon of deep mud. Lydia walked its length with a shovel handle, pushing it into the ground. In several places, it disappeared almost to the grip. A loaded wagon would sink to its axle. She returned to find Kieran kneeling beside Rowan. The chestnut mare rested her weight unevenly while he worked gentle circles into the strained tendon of her left foreleg. "She needs at least 2 more days," he said quietly. "Any farther now would only make it worse." He stood and wiped the mud from his hands. "Please let us stay 2 more days. I owe you for the nights of shelter and the meals. Tell me what work needs doing so I can earn our keep." Lydia studied him for a moment before handing him a milk bucket. "If you truly know farm work, milk the 2 cows in the east barn." Kieran paused at the doorway. "What are their names?" "Bess and Clover." He entered without another word. Bess accepted him immediately. Clover did not. Instead of forcing the nervous cow, Kieran approached from her left side, spoke softly, and rested a hand against her shoulder until she settled. Before milking, he examined each teat with practiced care. "This one's irritated," he called to Lydia. "Pour off the first milk and wash it with warm water today. It'll likely clear before it becomes something worse." Lydia stepped closer. She had noticed Clover acting restless. She had not yet found the cause. It was a small thing, but it was the first piece of evidence that the stranger understood more than he claimed. After cleaning the bucket, Kieran stopped near the front yard. Rainwater still flowed toward the house instead of away from it. "If you permit it," he said, "I'd like to cut a temporary drainage trench before the next storm." "You may use a shovel," Lydia replied. "Nothing from the tool shed." "Understood." He picked up the old shovel leaning against the fence and began marking the path by eye before breaking the first slice of earth. Inside the kitchen, Nell quietly sorted spoiled beans from good ones beside Lydia. Near the wash basin rested a small folded towel. No one mentioned it. Nell simply reached for it, dried her hands when the work was finished, then folded it neatly and returned it to the exact place where Lydia had left it. Kieran began with the temporary trench. Before long, he found the real problem. The old drainage ditch surrounding the house had almost disappeared beneath packed soil and thick grass roots. At the northwest corner, several foundation stones had settled after years of standing water. He stopped digging. "Lydia, I'd like you to see this before I go any farther." She knelt beside the exposed stones. "I've known about this corner," she admitted. "There was never enough time. Livestock came first." Kieran brushed loose dirt away with the back of the shovel. "If water keeps reaching the foundation, winter will freeze the wet ground. Frozen soil expands. That corner will rise again." He did not promise to save the house. He only explained what the ground would do. "We should reopen about 210 feet of ditch," he said. "A gentle grade south to the low field should carry the runoff away." Lydia unlocked the tool shed herself. She handed him the level, the spade, and a measuring line. The keys returned to her apron pocket. They worked side by side. Kieran cut the trench. Lydia measured the slope with wooden stakes and a tape. When the first line drifted too close to the vegetable garden, she stopped him. Shift it 3 feet east. He nodded. No argument. He lifted the shovel and started again. Nell carried drinking water between them. Later she gathered small stones and placed them beside each stake so the line remained visible. Near afternoon, another brief shower crossed the prairie. All three watched without speaking. The water reached the yard. Then it turned. Instead of flowing toward the house, it slipped into the new ditch, followed the fresh channel, and disappeared across the lower ground to the south. Lydia said nothing. She simply looked at the soil beside the foundation. For the first time in years, it was already beginning to dry. By the third morning, the road remained too soft for a loaded horse, and Rowan still favored her injured leg. While carrying buckets from the hand pump to the livestock trough, Lydia worked without complaint. Above her, the windmill turned lazily in the breeze. It simply produced no water. It stopped early this summer, she said. The last repairman believed the piston down in the well was worn out. Replacing it would have cost more than I could spare. Kieran looked up at the moving wheel. May I inspect everything above ground before we blame what's below? Lydia nodded. He climbed the tower slowly, checking each connection before touching a wrench. The blades were sound. The gearbox turned freely. Then he found it. The pitman rod carried a slight bend, small enough to escape a quick inspection, large enough to throw the pumping stroke off center. If the pump sat idle for months, Kieran said after climbing down, the leather cup may also have dried and shrunk. Lydia folded her arms. The other man wanted to pull the whole pump. I'm not saying he was wrong. Kieran wiped the grease from his hands. I'm saying we haven't earned that conclusion yet. He said they needed a forge to straighten the rod. Lydia sent for Elias Wren, the local blacksmith whose work kept half the valley's machinery alive. Elias arrived before noon. He listened more than he spoke. Together they removed the bent rod. Then, Elias heated it inside the forge until it glowed dull red, straightening it carefully against the anvil. Meanwhile, Kieran cut a fresh leather cup from well-oiled cowhide, trimming it to match the worn original. By late afternoon, everything was ready. Nell stood below the tower. 1. She counted as the wheel completed its first pumping stroke. Dark mud rose from the pipe. 2. Cloudy water mixed with sand splashed into the trough. 3. The flow strengthened. 4. Clearer water poured steadily into the basin. Lydia reached beneath the stream without speaking. Elias watched the rod move through its full stroke. It's running straight now, he said, the pistons holding pressure. Nell smiled and reached toward the fresh water. Not yet, Kieran said gently. Let it flush clean first. She lowered her hand without complaint. The first sign of success was never the same thing as finished work. Lydia watched the steady stream of water, then turned to Kieran. The 2 extra days he had asked for were up. The mare's leg hasn't fully healed, she said evenly, her eyes drifting toward the revived windmill, and this farm still has plenty of work waiting. You and your daughter may stay until the horse is fully recovered, if you agree to help me repair the rest. Kieran said nothing at first. He looked toward Nell, who stood beside the trough, watching the clear water rise. Then his gaze moved across the barn, the sagging fence, and the weathered buildings beyond it. I point out what needs fixing, he asked, and you make the final call? It's my farm. A faint understanding passed across his face. Then we'll stay until Rowan is ready. That afternoon, Orendalo, a neighboring rancher whose land bordered Lydia's western fence, rode over to inspect the damage left by the storm. He noticed the fresh drainage ditch before he reached the porch. Then the steady stream of water filling the livestock trough. Finally, the stranger standing beside it. How long has he been here? Oren asked. The roads are still unsafe, Lydia replied. The mare injured her leg. Oren's eyes drifted across the yard. He seems to be finishing work that's waited here for months. Lydia said nothing. My brother once gave a traveler a place to sleep, Oren continued. He lost a horse and half his savings before the man disappeared. His warning carried experience, not gossip. After a pause, he added, "Have you thought any more about leasing me your West Field? The farm isn't dying badly enough to divide it." Orrin glanced toward the repaired windmill. Temporary repairs usually last until the real cold arrives. Kieran never answered. He simply checked the connecting pin on the pump rod one more time. Orrin shifted his attention to Nell. "Do you know how long your father plans to stay?" Nell's hand closed around the little tin spoon hidden inside her pocket. She looked at Lydia before speaking. "We'll leave when Rowan is well." Before Orrin could ask another question, Lydia stepped off the porch and quietly placed herself between the rancher and the child. "Questions for adults should stay with adults," she said evenly. "A little girl isn't the place to test your suspicions." For a moment, neither man spoke. Orrin tipped his hat. "I meant no harm." "I know," Lydia answered. But the question was still misplaced. He nodded once, turned his horse, and rode back toward the western road. The yard grew quiet again. After he disappeared beyond the hill, Nell looked up. "Did I answer wrong?" Lydia shook her head. "No." She rested a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. The adults were asking the wrong question. The nights kept growing colder. One morning Lydia climbed into the root cellar and found damp earth seeping through the base of the north wall. If the moisture continued, part of her apples, potatoes, and dried beans would never survive the winter. Kieran offered to repair it before he and Nell moved on. The cellar sat nearly 6 feet 8 inches below ground, its earthen walls reinforced with fieldstone. An old ventilation opening on the north side had been sealed years earlier. Together they carried standing water outside, replaced several rotted support boards, and brushed a thin coat of lime over the damp wall. Wanting to keep out both water and cold, Kieran sealed every remaining gap. 3 days later, the cellar looked better. The walls felt dry. Moisture no longer gathered beneath the jar lids. Lydia believed the problem had been solved. Above the kitchen, Nell helped string apples from the rafters. "My mother always said to smell food before looking at it," she said quietly. 6 days later, she entered the cellar for potatoes. She stopped. Something smelled wrong, sweet, sour, only faintly. She called for Lydia. At the bottom of one basket, 2 apples had softened. Brown spots spread beneath their skins, and beads of moisture clung to the fruit. Lydia's voice hardened. "You told me the cellar would stay dry." Kieran inspected the walls, then the baskets, then the sealed vent. He nodded once. "I stopped the water." His eyes settled on the closed opening, and I stopped the air. He looked back at Lydia. "I solved half the problem." A brief silence. "And made the other half worse." He offered no excuse. No explanation about old stone, weather, or bad luck. Instead, he asked only one question. "If you'll allow it, I'd like to repair what I did wrong." Lydia agreed. But this time she added one condition. "Explain every change before you make it." "I will."
Understood, ma'am.
Kieran lit a narrow strip of cloth and held it near the cellar floor. The smoke drifted upward. Then it stopped. It gathered beneath the ceiling instead of leaving the room. "The cellar doesn't only need dry walls," Kieran said. "It needs slow, steady air." Together they reopened the old north vent.
Just enough to breathe.
Using hollow cottonwood sections, Kieran built a low intake ending about 8 inches above the floor. Across the cellar, they raised a higher exhaust channel that climbed near the ceiling before passing beneath the roof overhang. "Not too much," Lydia warned. "Winter air could freeze everything, so we'll make it adjustable." He fitted simple sliding wooden shutters over both openings. They raised every storage shelf off the ground, placed shallow trays of clean sand beneath them, and left space between the baskets and the walls. 2 days later, Nell lit another strip of cloth. The smoke hesitated. Then it leaned gently toward the upper vent. Not quickly, but it moved. The following morning, Lydia checked the cellar herself. The thin film of moisture beneath the jar lids had disappeared. Kieran said nothing about being right. Instead, he opened every apple basket, removed the spoiled fruit, and carved the next inspection date onto a small wooden tag before hanging it beside the cellar door. That afternoon, Lydia crossed the yard carrying the cellar key. She placed it in Kieran's hand. For the first time since he had arrived, she did not walk beside him when he unlocked an important part of her farm. Word spread quickly through Cottonwood Flats. A stranger had been staying at the Braddock farm. One afternoon, Prudence Ashford, a respected churchwoman known for visiting families in difficult times, arrived carrying a wool blanket, a loaf of fresh bread, and a bottle of cough syrup. Her gifts were genuine. Her questions were deliberate. She noticed where Kieran's boots rested beside the front door. She counted the extra place at the table. Then she turned to Lydia. "Do you truly believe a woman living alone should shelter a man whose past she doesn't know?" Lydia folded the blanket before answering. "I know his name. I know his trade. I know he has a daughter. That doesn't prove he's trustworthy." "No, it doesn't. But it doesn't make him guilty either." Prudence sighed. "The community is only trying to protect you." Lydia met her eyes. Protection offered without being asked for has a habit of becoming control. Outside, Kieran heard every word while replacing the bent hinge on the storage shed. He never walked toward the porch. Inside the kitchen, Nell quietly listened as strangers discussed her father as though he were a danger waiting to happen. Without speaking, she picked up her mother's tin spoon from beside her bowl and slipped it back into her pocket. Prudence eventually left. The yard became quiet once more. Lydia noticed what Nell had done. She opened the small drawer beside the kitchen stove. "If you'd like," she said softly, "your spoon can stay here." She left the drawer open. "No one in this house will touch it without asking you first." Nell stood motionless for several long moments. Then, with careful hands, she placed the spoon inside the drawer and closed it gently. For the first time since arriving at the farm, the one thing she treasured most no longer had to remain hidden against her body. That evening, after Nell had fallen asleep, Lydia and Kieran sat at the kitchen table checking supplies for the coming winter. Beans, salt, lamp oil, flour. After a long silence, Kieran looked up. "Why didn't you hire help before now?" "I did." She marked another number in the ledger. "They usually left after harvest." Her voice suggested the answer reached much farther back than seasonal work. Several quiet moments passed before she continued. "My husband sold the wheat crop without telling me." She turned another page. "He took the money." Another pause, and the two best horses. He left a note, nothing more. It said farm life had become too small for him. She did not call it betrayal. She did not call it heartbreak. She simply rested one hand over the ring of keys lying beside the ledger. "Since that day, I've carried every key myself." Kieran offered no easy comfort. Instead, he spoke of May, who had died after a hard winter fever when Nell was only 3 years old. "For a long time," he said quietly, "I believed I could have changed the ending if I'd worked harder, if I'd found a doctor sooner, if I'd kept the house warmer." Lydia looked across the table. "Do you still believe that?" Kieran watched the lantern flame for a long time before answering. "Some mornings I know. The answer is no." A faint smile without happiness crossed his face. "Some nights I still live as though the answer might be yes." Lydia lowered her eyes to his hands. They were never still. Always repairing. Always adjusting. Always checking one more hinge, one more latch, one more board before darkness came. She finally understood why. He wasn't only afraid of broken things. He was afraid of arriving too late again. Without thinking, Lydia unclipped the ring of keys from her apron and laid it on the table between them. She did not hand it to him. She did not take it back. For the first time in nearly 11 years, She no longer needed to feel their weight against her side every waking moment. November arrived with a steadier north wind. One light snowfall dusted the fields before melting by afternoon. But Kieran watched where the drifting snow gathered. Even after a minor storm, it piled against the north side of the barn door. He studied the wind for another hour before speaking. "I think we should build a snow fence." Lydia looked up from reinforcing the barn wall. "We still have a roof to finish." "We do. But the roof won't matter much if the doorway disappears beneath a drift." He measured roughly 35 yards into the open field north of the barn, about 125 feet long. "Not solid," he added. "The gaps matter as much as the wood." He drew 2 lines across the dirt with a stick. "If the fence stands too close, the snow will fall right in front of the barn." He scratched a second line farther away. "If it's too far, the wind won't slow soon enough." Lydia studied the marks. "The north wall comes first." It should. For the next several days they divided the work. Old cottonwood boards strengthened the barn walls. Layers of tar paper and dry grass filled the space between the inner and outer siding. They moved the feed trough away from the cold draft near the door. Without mentioning it, Kieran lowered the barn door handle several inches, just enough for Nell to reach it comfortably. Afterward, he began weaving willow branches between evenly spaced fence posts. The fence looked strangely open, more empty space than wood. Late one afternoon, Orrin rode past and laughed. "Looks like you're weaving a basket big enough for the whole prairie." Kieran never looked up from his work. Nell glanced toward her father. "Is he right?" Kieran tied another willow branch into place before answering. "He would be." He checked the wind once more. "If we built it in the wrong place." A few days later, another light snow swept across the fields. This time Kieran walked the drift line before sunrise. Most of the fence worked exactly as expected. One western section did not. Without defending the original plan, he pulled up several posts and moved that portion about 6 yards farther west. He trusted what the wind showed him more than what he had first imagined. That afternoon, Nell walked to the barn carrying a bucket. She reached for the lowered handle. The door opened easily. Lydia noticed. She never asked why the handle had been moved. She already knew. The weeks settled into a steady rhythm. The drainage ditch kept the foundation dry. The windmill filled the livestock trough every morning. The root cellar stayed cool without trapping damp air. The north barn wall no longer whistled beneath the wind. The willow snow fence stretched quietly across the field, waiting for winter to judge it. One afternoon, Kieran built a small wooden stool from leftover scraps. Nell asked if it was for her. "It keeps you off the flour barrel," he said. "I'm really protecting the barrel." She laughed. Soon, she placed 3 cups on the breakfast table every morning. Lydia noticed. She never removed the third one. Even Copper, the one-eyed barn cat that trusted almost no one, began sleeping near the kitchen door while Nell strung apples to dry. "Can we keep him?" Nell asked. Lydia smiled faintly. "No one keeps an old barn cat. He stays where he chooses." Later that week, Lydia found Kieran oiling the front gate hinge. For years, the gate had announced itself with a long, rusty squeal. A few drops of oil and one carefully shaped wooden shim silenced it completely. "It wasn't broken," Lydia observed. "No." Kieran closed the gate once more. "It just told the whole farm every time someone opened it." The corner of Lydia's mouth almost lifted. That evening she realized something quietly. She had stopped counting how many meals Kieran and Nell had shared beneath her roof. After supper, Nell fell asleep at the kitchen table while sorting dried beans. Before Kieran returned from the barn, Lydia gently lifted the little girl into her arms and carried her to bed. Only after laying Nell beneath the blanket did Lydia notice what she had done. She did not let go immediately. Early in December, the mail carrier stopped at the Braddock farm with a reply addressed to Kieran. Weeks earlier, he had sent a message to Fort Harlan explaining his broken wagon and temporary whereabouts. The mill owner in Fort Harlan still wanted him. If he arrived within 10 days, the job remained his. Steady wages, a warm room behind the mill, reliable work through winter. Kieran read the letter once, then again. He folded it before Nell could see the final paragraph. The room behind the mill was too small for children. He never read those lines aloud, secretly hoping he could still negotiate and make space for his daughter once they arrived. Later that afternoon, he found Lydia repairing a harness strap. "I need to see whether the job is what I was promised," he said. "I can't stay here simply because there's work to do, or because I owe you." Lydia kept sewing. "The farm can pay wages." He looked up. "The windmill needs watching. The livestock won't care that it's winter. The barn still needs someone." Kieran waited before speaking again. "Is that a job offer?" His voice remained calm. "Or another way of saying something else?" The needle stopped moving. When Lydia answered, her voice had grown carefully distant. "It's only work." Kieran nodded. "I understand." He accepted the answer exactly as she gave it. He asked nothing more. That evening, Nell opened the kitchen drawer and lifted out her mother's tin spoon. "Should I take it with us?" Lydia looked toward the open drawer. After a long silence, she answered, "The important things should stay with the people they belong to." Lydia looked toward the open drawer. Nell slipped the spoon safely into her pocket. When she packed the next morning, she carried it with her. She left behind the little wooden stool. She also left a string of apples only half finished, still hanging beside the kitchen window. Before climbing into the wagon, Nell scratched Copper gently behind one ear. "Will he forget me?" Lydia glanced toward the old barn cat. "Copper doesn't forget the people who feed him on time." Nell smiled faintly. After the wagon disappeared beyond the hill, Lydia walked back to the porch. Without thinking, she placed a small handful of scraps beneath the front step, exactly where Nell had always fed the old cat. Kieran and Nell left beneath a clear winter sky. Rowan's leg had healed. With Elias Wren's help, a new forged axle carried the repaired wagon toward Fort Harlan. Before they departed, Lydia tucked a bag of dried apples beside Nell. She quietly reinforced a loose seam on Kieran's gloves. "The old stitching will split in wet snow." He thanked her. Neither of them said what remained unsaid. Kieran placed the root cellar key on the kitchen table before leaving. Lydia picked it up. "You should keep the barn key." He looked at her. "In case you come back before I hear the gate." It was the closest thing to an invitation either of them could offer. Then they were gone. The farmhouse returned to silence. But the silence no longer fit. The first morning, Lydia automatically placed 3 cups on the breakfast table. She quietly put 2 away. On the third morning, she again set out 3 cups. This time she left them there until noon. Every afternoon, Copper waited beneath the kitchen step. By the 6th day, the weather began to change. The cattle turned their backs toward the north. A pale ring circled the moon after sunset. The air pressure dropped. An old string of drying apples stirred beneath the porch roof, even though the wind itself had barely begun. Nature was preparing something larger. On the 9th day, Lydia glanced out the window and saw the front gate swinging open. It made no sound. The hinge Kieran had repaired stayed perfectly quiet. She stepped outside before the farm dog even barked. There, beyond the gate, stood Kieran. Nell smiled beside him. Rowan waited patiently between them. Before Kieran could speak, Lydia crossed the yard and opened the inner gate herself. "I went to Fort Harlan," Kieran said. The work was exactly as promised. He paused. "Everything except one thing." Lydia waited. "They had room for me." His eyes drifted toward Nell. "But not for my daughter. I was told another family would take her through the winter. I couldn't accept that." He looked back toward the farmhouse. "I came back because no job is worth dividing the only family I have left." Nell quietly walked into the kitchen. She opened the small drawer beside the stove. Then she placed her mother's tin spoon back into its familiar place. Lydia watched from the doorway. She smiled only with her voice.
Child, you best wash your hands.
Wash your hands. Supper will be ready soon. There was no further discussion about Fort Harlan after supper. Lydia never asked whether he had returned because of her or because of the farm. In truth, there was no time to dwell on it. That night, the north wind rose without warning. By dawn, it screamed across the prairie. Snow raced sideways. The road disappeared. Fence posts vanished within minutes. The temperature plunged toward 24 degrees below zero. The blizzard settled over the plains. One day, then another, then a third. There were no speeches, only work. Kieran checked the barn, the windmill, and the willow snow fence every few hours. Lydia measured food, counted firewood, and managed every animal inside the barn. Nell kept a small slate board beside the kitchen door. Each bucket of water, each sack of feed, each day's ration. Nothing was left to memory. Outside, the willow fence did exactly what it had been built to do. Snow collected against the fence nearly 30 yards north of the barn. The drift grew taller. The yard behind it remained open. The barn doors still swung freely. No one had to dig a path before feeding the cattle. Inside, the reinforced north wall no longer hissed beneath the wind. The animals spread naturally through the shelter instead of crowding into one frozen corner. Late on the second morning, the windmill slowed, then stopped. Ice had locked part of the pumping mechanism. Kieran reached for his coat. Lydia caught his sleeve. Not without this. She wrapped a safety rope around his waist herself and secured the other end to the tower before letting him climb. The wind pushed hard. Ice cracked beneath his hammer. One careful strike, another. The frozen linkage broke free. The wheel shuddered, then turned. A moment later, the pump answered with its familiar rhythm. Water flowed once again. Below ground, the root cellar remained calm. The apples stayed dry. The potatoes never froze. The bean jars showed no trace of condensation beneath their lids. Near the cellar entrance, Nell lit a narrow strip of cloth. The smoke rose, paused, then leaned gently toward the upper vent. Not quickly, but it moved. She looked toward Kieran. He simply nodded. Outside, the wind continued its endless roar. Nature never spoke. It only judged. Everything they had repaired was finally standing before its only honest test. Late on the second day of the blizzard, heavy pounding echoed against the front gate. When Kieran forced it open, Orindallo stood outside with 2 exhausted cattle. His beard was white with ice. "My north barn door disappeared under the drift," he said between breaths. "I had to break part of the wall just to save these 2. Lydia opened the secondary barn without hesitation. Together, she and Kieran guided the frightened animals inside. Only then did Orin stop to study the field. The great snowdrift rested exactly where the willow fence had been built to hold it. Far beyond the barn, the yard itself remained open. People could still walk. The doors still opened. Orin lowered his head. "I put the snow in the wrong place." Nothing more. No long apology. None was needed. Later that afternoon, Prudence arrived with 3 travelers whose sleigh had become trapped on the open prairie. The farmhouse grew crowded. Lydia organized the meals: dried apples, beans, salt pork. Food preserved weeks earlier now fed far more than one household. Prudence quietly watched Nell untie another string of dried apples. Without those careful harvests, without the repaired cellar, without the slow ventilation, much of it would already have spoiled. She understood that without saying so. Before sunset, Elias Wren reached the farm with another rescue party. He inspected the windmill one last time. "The linkage is still true," he said. "Pressure's holding." Then he picked up a shovel. Nobody stood around discussing who had been right. Everyone worked. Oren cleared snow from the side entrance. Prudence divided food into equal portions. Elias checked the windmill after every burst of freezing rain. Kieran kept the fires burning and the livestock watered. Lydia recorded every ration in her ledger. Nell carried bowls from the kitchen as quickly as her small legs allowed. Near the end of the third day, she handed Prudence the last full bowl. Without hesitation, Nell reached for the smaller serving left behind. Lydia noticed. Quietly, while Nell looked toward the stove, she exchanged the bowls. The child never saw it happen. By the time the blizzard finally passed, every person beneath Lydia's roof remained alive. Every animal inside the Braddock barn survived. No one celebrated. The prairie had simply delivered its verdict, and for the first time since Kieran had stepped through the gate asking for only one night, no one questioned whether the work had been worth doing. When the storm finally passed, Cottonwood Flats emerged beneath deep snow. Several barns had lost their roofs. More than one windmill stood, but the Braddock farm stood unbroken. Every repair they had made had survived nature's judgment. Oren returned a few days later after the roads reopened. He collected his cattle, left behind a coil of fencing wire, and spent 2 full days helping repair damaged fences without asking for payment. No one mentioned the willow fence. No one needed to. Prudence came back, carrying empty jars instead of questions. "How many should I bring before next harvest?" she asked Lydia. "More than last year," Lydia answered. Life did not suddenly become perfect. Lydia still grew sharp whenever fear arrived before reason. Kieran still reached for a hammer before searching for words. Some nights Nell still whispered for her mother while asleep. Grief had not disappeared. It had simply learned to live beside hope. Every morning, Nell placed 3 cups on the kitchen table. May's tin spoon rested quietly inside the kitchen drawer beside the other spoons. It was never hidden again. One evening, after the last chores were finished, Kieran walked into the kitchen carrying the barn key. He placed it gently into Lydia's hand. "I shouldn't assume I have the right to keep this." Lydia looked at the familiar ring of keys resting in her palm. For years she had carried every one of them because she believed letting go meant losing everything. Slowly, she unclipped a smaller key from the ring. She crossed the room to the wall beside the kitchen door. There had always been one nail. Now she drove in a second. She hung the smaller key there. Then she turned toward Kieran. The house key. A quiet pause settled between them. "Don't lose it." Kieran looked at the key, then at Lydia. He did not answer with promises. He did not offer grateful speeches. Instead, he removed his hat and hung it on the empty hook beside the door. Outside, the north wind moved softly through the willow fence. Snow settled exactly where the fence guided it to settle. Inside, the stove burned with a steady flame. It no longer leaned toward the north wall. The Braddock farm had been restored before winter claimed the prairie. Lydia's heart had not been won like a prize. It had been entrusted to a man who had spent every day proving that he knew how to enter another person's life, do his share of the work, and remain there without ever trying to take away her right to decide. Nothing more needed to be said.